Hello and welcome to this short tutorial that goes some way to evaluate the condition of the Russian Empire on the eve of the outbreak of the First World War. It goes some way to measure and assess how close Russia was to revolution before foreign affairs took on a life of their own and began to dictate events both overseas and inside the Russian Empire. 1913, the year before the outbreak of war, marked the Romanov dynasty's 300th anniversary. It was commemorated in a number of ways, including this short video. This footage shows the declaration of the birth of the Russian Empire by Mikhail Romanov in 1613. Supported by the Orthodox Russian Church, the signing of that declaration, let's skip it forward a bit. So it takes us through the 300 years, various conflicts, key events in that dynasty. Nicholas II's grandfather, Alexander III, his father rather. And here we have some live, real footage of the celebrations on the centenary itself. There is Nicholas and Alexander being in the horse-drawn cart. Arrival at the cathedral in Kazan. And there we have Nicholas and Alexander again. There was a huge ceremony outside Kazan Cathedral and outside the Winter Palace in St. Petersburg. And there's the royal couple, and you can see Nicholas's poorly son being carried there by one of the officials. And that's a small poster showing all of the aristocracy in that Romanov dynasty. So let's evaluate exactly how far Russia had improved by 1914 throughout this studied period. So politically, there are major developments that have taken place prior to the outbreak of the First World War. Russia now has an elected Duma, an elected parliament that is supposed to represent the views of the population. And we also have a system of zemstva, of these local elected councils that is hoping to give the Russian people some say. On paper, we also have a weakened autocracy and a fairer constitution. Remember, on paper, the State Duma, State Council, and the Council of Ministers should all support legislation if it's to go through. And also, those three bodies and the Tsar had a veto to cancel out any legislation supported by the others. So technically, this is a weakened autocracy that is supported by a constitution that is supposed to represent the Russian people. However, we already know that the power of both the Duma and the Zemstva were very limited, both by the fundamental laws that Nicholas II announced on the eve of the State Duma being launched, and also by some of the changes from Stolypin in terms of who could and could not vote, the franchisement of the State Duma, and also the use of emergency laws and emergency powers. Also, towards the end and lead into 1914, the makeup of local zemstva had changed considerably in favour of gentry and landowning classes. Economically, the major improvements have taken place. Russia is now a sounder economy and less reliant on foreign investment, mainly from France. Remember, it was French money that funded, and British money to a lesser extent, that funded amazing breakthroughs in the growth of the Russian railway services and infrastructure, and also in the building of heavy industry factories. But now Russia is going some way to become self-sufficient. It is making its own money and can invest that money back into its own economy, and so it's less reliant on foreign investment. By 1914, both heavy and light industry is starting to compete with that of Western Europe, and Russia is now one of the, I think it's around about the fifth leading economy. Major breakthroughs in the oil production, second only to Texas in the USA. We also have major developments from the kulaks, these prosperous agricultural businessmen and entrepreneurs. Not only are they starting to make money and becoming viable agricultural businesses, but that money is putting that growth is putting money back into the pockets of agricultural people, who are in turn spending money on consumer goods. So all of that is feeding economic growth in Russia. However, we know that conditions did not improve for these workers. Although wages were rising, they were not rising anywhere near the rate of inflation, and so there may have been more money in the pockets of these agricultural workers, but products were simply costing 5 times more than that. And as we know from earlier tutorials, Stolypin's reforms helped these kulaks but harmed others. This sense of competition in agricultural production meant that there were losers as well as winners. Socially, the position of the peasantry had improved slowly. There were educational improvements in terms of the curriculum and the number of schools. There was some legislation to support state welfare and help the poorest members of the community, but it was very much in its earliest days. We do see an increase in the number of qualified professionals such as lawyers, doctors and teachers, but nowhere near enough, especially to serve rural areas. There is still 60% illiteracy in across Russia, and the conditions of these workers didn't really improve. So in the midst of this, we have the Tsar, Nicholas II, who fails to appreciate the consequences of economic modernization. Whilst Russia modernizes, he is left trying to maintain an autocracy that is now 300 years old. Nicholas was reactionary. He failed to see future events and future problems arising, and so his reactions and his solutions were very short-term and knee-jerk. He was still trying to oppress political views, much like his father and his grandfather had, and he was a very inefficient leader, handwriting letters instead of having a good system behind him, and he is going about things poorly. And some of this is down to the poor appointments he is making in terms of key civil service appointments. So, the future. How close was Russia to revolution on the outbreak of war? For the Tsar himself, things looked promising. Liberal and educated classes had grown, more conservative, and distanced themselves from the disruptive radicals who were now divided and too busy squabbling in the Duma to form any coordinated and reasonable opposition. The Marxists were clearly divided, and this was compounded by, in 1909, Pyotr Struve, a leading social democrat, had denounced revolution. And foreign affairs were a welcome distraction and made people more patriotic and in support of the Tsar. On the other hand, however, really and truly, the problems of the 1905 revolution and the promises of the 1906 October Manifesto have not been addressed. As a result, political assassinations are still prevalent. Aristocracy and leading politicians are not comfortable because of these assassinations. We see intense oppression of social revolutionaries, and over 4,500 sentenced to death in a very short period of time. 2,500 of those sentenced were actually executed. The State Dumas and the Zemstva are still predominantly anti-Tsarist and want a change. There is the restlessness and discontent among peasants and industrial workers, and this manifests itself in a wave of strikes in 1912 and 1913. And by 1914, the number of strikes actually surpasses that in 1905. The Bolsheviks are an influence here, and they influence the trade unions that make these strikes happen. And a further statistic worth paying a note of, or paying attention to, is the fact that the Bolshevik newspaper Pravda, or The Truth, sold over 40,000 copies a day. and many more were reading that in addition to that 40,000. So, how close was Russia to revolution on evaluation and having looking at this? The decision's up to you.